I never thought a fence could start a war. But here I was, standing in my backyard, staring at splintered wood, nails bent and scattered, and the jagged remains of what used to be my carefully built fence. The HOA had done it. Not by accident, not by some bureaucratic oversight deliberately. They claimed it violated regulations that somehow didn't exist the week before. I had photos, permits, everything. Yet, when I called, the HOA manager's smug voice told me, rules are rules, and your fence doesn't comply. It felt personal. It felt like they were poking at me just to prove a point, like some twisted game of power. I thought, maybe I can reason with them. I tried to explain how long I had spent building the fence, how it wasn't harming anyone, how it was part of my property. I thought logic might work. It didn't. Next came the letters. The fines. The threats of legal action. The passive-aggressive emails stacked one on top of the other. They painted me as the problem homeowner while their committee members sipped coffee in the shade of their manicured lawns. I tried to stay calm, tried to play by the rules, but each day my backyard looked more like a war zone. And that's when the idea hit me. Not a petty prank, not a small act of rebellion, but something unforgettable. Something that would make them feel exactly what I felt every time I walked past that destroyed fence. I imagined their perfectly maintained pool, sparkling and serene, reflecting their sense of control. I imagined that perfect surface marred by mud, chaos, and the unmistakable mark of revenge. I spent nights planning, walking around the neighborhood, noting patrol schedules, HOA habits, everything. Every detail mattered. I couldn't risk getting caught, this had to be flawless. Every action, every step, had to ensure that when it happened, they couldn't claim ignorance. By the time I went to sleep that night, I had a plan that made me grin in the dark. I was no longer just a victim of bureaucracy, I was about to become the storm that exposed their hypocrisy. And it all started with a shovel, a bucket, and the determination to make them regret ever touching my fence. The next morning, the neighborhood would never look at me the same way. The sun was barely up, but I was already outside, walking along the HOA's property lines like a general surveying a battlefield. I needed every detail, every weakness, memorized. Their pool wasn't just a pool, it was a fortress of perfection. Sparkling blue water, pristine tiles, a deck that gleamed under the morning sun. It screamed control, discipline, and the smug satisfaction of people who think rules are meant to keep others down. I crouched behind hedges, pretending to admire my own lawn, while taking notes on the pool layout. Where were the drains? How high were the fences? Did anyone ever linger outside early in the morning? Even the position of their sprinklers mattered. It was absurd, maybe, that I was analyzing sprinklers like a military strategist, but every little detail counted. One slip-up could ruin the entire plan. As I observed, I realized something else: the HOA had habits. They arrived at the same times, sipped the same coffee, greeted each other with predictable smiles. I could anticipate their movements. And that predictability was my advantage. They had structured control, rigid schedules, but that rigidity made them predictable. Predictable was exploitable. I also made mental notes of their weaknesses: the gate on the side, slightly loose, the landscaping area that caught early morning dew and became muddy, the corner of the deck that always seemed dry, even after rain. Each tiny flaw was a puzzle piece in my revenge. I smiled at the thought nature and timing were on my side. By mid-morning, I had mapped everything in my mind. But observation alone wasn't enough. I needed supplies. Buckets, mud, perhaps even some garden tools that could be plausibly accidental if noticed. The plan was starting to feel real, tangible, almost inevitable. The more I prepared, the more exhilarated I became. I wasn't just fighting bureaucracy anymore, I was reclaiming power, turning their obsession with order against them. I returned home with a backpack full of everything I might need: careful to avoid any neighborly questions. Even the weight of the supplies in my arms made the plan feel heavier, more serious, more unstoppable. I looked at my own backyard for a moment, still ruined by the fence incident. That destruction fueled me. Every splinter of wood, every crooked nail, whispered the same message: this isn't over. By nightfall, I laid out my tools, rehearsed my steps in my mind, and visualized the chaos I was about to unleash. It wasn't reckless, it was precise, calculated, and poetic. The next morning, I would make the HOA pay not with words, not with fines, but with mud, mess, and the ultimate poetic justice. The night before everything unfolded felt unreal, like the world was holding its breath with me. The streets were quiet, the houses dim, and the neighborhood rested under a thin blanket of silence that made every sound seem louder than it should be. I stood in my garage, surrounded by buckets, rope, gloves, and the freshly dug earth I had gathered from the soft patch behind my yard. It wasn't just mud, it was symbolic, a messy reflection of everything the HOA had dragged me through. I rehearsed the plan again in my head. Timing was critical. The sprinklers near the side gate turned on at 4 in the morning, and the maintenance crew usually arrived just after sunrise. That narrow window was my opportunity. I checked my watch repeatedly, pacing slowly, letting anticipation settle into focus. I wasn't nervous anymore. I was determined. The wrecked remains of my fence loomed through the garage window like a silent witness, reminding me exactly why I was doing this. I thought about the first meeting I'd ever attended with the HOA. The forced smiles. The clipped voices. The subtle threats wrapped in policy language. That was when I realized they didn't enforce rules for fairness, they enforced them for control. And tonight, I was going to loosen that grip. Not with violence. Not with confrontation. But with poetic, undeniable consequences. I stepped outside and breathed in the cool air. The sky was dark, but a faint glow lingered over the rooftops, the kind that appears just before dawn decides to wake the world. I tested each step across the grass, making sure every movement was silent. Even the ground beneath my shoe seemed to cooperate, firm enough to carry me but soft enough to help me disappear. I loaded the first bucket into my cart. Heavy. Damp. Perfect. The mud clung to the sides like it knew where it was headed. I tightened my gloves and whispered to myself, "You didn't start this, but you're going to finish it." The words steadied me. I wasn't acting out of spite. I was acting out of justice, of balance, of finally standing up after being pushed one time too many. By the time the clock hit 3:58, my heart was calm, my mind sharp, and my plan ready. The night was still quiet, but not for long. Before dawn even had the courage to show itself, I rolled the cart toward the side gate, every wheel squeaking like it wanted to betray me. The sprinklers hissed to life right on schedule, their steady rhythm masking my footsteps beneath a curtain of mist. I slipped through the loose panel I had scouted days earlier, heart steady, mind sharpened into focus. Ahead of me, the HOA's pristine pool shimmered under pale security lights, flawless and smug, like a monument to their arrogance. For a moment, I simply stared at it, that perfect symbol of everything they had taken from me. I knelt by the landscaping bed and opened the first bucket. The mud was heavy, dense, and dark, gathered from the softest patch of soil behind my yard. It clung to my gloves as if eager for what came next. I took a breath, lifted the bucket, and tipped it toward the shallow end. The mud slid into the water in a slow, spiraling cloud, staining the blue with earthy brown. It was quiet. Peaceful. Almost poetic. One bucket became two. Two became four. Each cascade spread farther, turning clarity into chaos, stripping the pool of its polished image. The water churned silently as the filter kicked on, pulling the mud deeper, grinding it through the system like a living thing. Nature itself was helping me. I moved with purpose, every motion rehearsed, every placement intentional. I dragged soil from the wet edge of the sprinklers, mixing it with the collected earth to make it thicker, heavier, impossible to ignore, and even harder to clean. This wasn't vandalism. This was balance. This was what it felt like to wake up and see something you built destroyed by people who hid behind rules. As I worked, I remembered the day they tore my fence down, how they didn't even look at me while doing it. No apology. No respect. Just paperwork and superiority. Now their sanctuary looked the way my yard had looked: ruined, violated, undeniable. The eastern sky began to glow, faint and threatening. My window was closing. I wiped the last smear of mud along the stone coping, making sure there would be no doubt that what happened here wasn't an accident, it was a message. I stepped back, breathing in the damp air, watching the water swirl into a muddy nightmare. For the first time since they destroyed my fence, I felt something like relief. The first light of dawn stretched over the neighborhood, and with it came the silence that follows a storm. From my vantage point behind the hedges, I watched the HOA's pristine pool, once a mirror of perfection, now churned into a muddy, brown mess. The water, thick and opaque, reflected none of their pride, none of their control. It was chaos in liquid form, a poetic twist that left me grinning even before anyone saw it. I stayed hidden for a moment, letting the morning settle. And then, like clockwork, the HOA maintenance crew arrived. They were early risers, always punctual, always precise. Their footsteps crunched on the gravel driveway, their voices light and casual, completely unaware of the disaster waiting just a few feet away. I could hear them joke about mundane things: sprinklers, garden schedules, oblivious to the impending shock that would redefine their day. When they reached the pool, the first reaction was disbelief. One of them stopped mid-step, staring, mouth slightly open. The other squinted, trying to understand if the sunlight was playing tricks on him. Then came the exclamations. A shout. What the hell happened here? I couldn't hear the words clearly through the distance, but their tones, panic, confusion, anger, rang loud enough. I almost laughed aloud, but held it back. Neighbors began to peek out their windows. A few ventured outside, their morning walks interrupted by the sight. I imagined their expressions: shock, curiosity, maybe even a hint of admiration for the audacity it took to turn the HOA sanctuary into a mess they couldn't ignore. I had disrupted their world, but with no violence, no confrontation, just calculated, undeniable consequences. The HOA manager arrived minutes later, still in a bathrobe, holding his coffee like a shield. His face went pale when he saw the pool. He waved his hands frantically, shouting orders, demanding explanations, threatening fines and insurance claims. The chaos he had once inflicted on me with mere words was now his reality: palpable, messy, and utterly irreversible. From my hidden position, I felt a rush of satisfaction, a deep, grounding sense of victory. This wasn't just revenge. This was justice tailored to their arrogance. For once, they had to feel the helplessness, the frustration, the sheer loss of control that they had imposed on others. I stayed for a while longer, soaking in the spectacle. Every shout, every frantic movement, every horrified glance reaffirmed that my plan had worked perfectly. The muddy nightmare wasn't just a mess, it was a message. The chaos around the pool spread through the neighborhood like a rumor drifting on cool morning air. By noon, the HOA board clustered near the patio, their voices brittle, their tempers fraying. They weren't just furious about the mud, they were terrified of what it revealed: that their control could be shaken. I watched from a shaded corner, unseen, listening as blame ricocheted between them like loose gravel on pavement. One member accused the maintenance crew of negligence, another insisted it had to be sabotage. The manager paced in rigid circles, muttering about security footage, liability, and insurance premiums. His confidence, once unshakable, now wavered with every anxious breath. I could almost taste the irony. When they destroyed my fence, they called it procedure. Now, facing their own disaster, they called it unacceptable. Neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering, watching, speculating. Some shook their heads, others smirked behind polite expressions. For years, the HOA had ruled with clipped memos and cold letters. Today they stood under the same scrutiny they had forced on everyone else. I didn't need to speak, the pool spoke for me. Soon contractors arrived, shaking their heads at the damage. Pumps roared, hoses uncoiled, and muddy water surged into the drains like a retreating tide. The crew estimated days of cleanup and thousands in repairs. The board exchanged pale glances, realizing this wasn't a problem they could erase with a letter or a fine. As I slipped away, my steps light, I felt the weight I'd carried for weeks begin to lift. I wasn't celebrating chaos, I was reclaiming dignity, reminding them that power without empathy eventually collapses. Still, I knew the story wasn't finished. The HOA would search, question, and suspect. And when they did, they'd learn something important. I wasn't the meek homeowner they once dismissed. I went home, closed my door, and waited, calm, patient, ready for whatever came next. Their questions would circle the neighborhood, and every path would lead back to the ruined fence they tried to forget. That memory was my alibi and my motive, wrapped together like two strands of wire. I knew they'd wonder whether the person they'd pushed too far had finally pushed back. As evening settled, the neighborhood fell quiet again, but the silence felt different. It carried tension, curiosity, and the faint tremor of doubt echoing through every board member's thoughts. For the first time, they feared the consequences of their own decisions. And as I stood by my broken fence, tracing the rough edges of splintered wood, I realized something simple: this wasn't just revenge. It was a reminder that respect cannot be demanded by force, it must be earned. The mud would wash away eventually, but the lesson would linger longer than the mess. The next morning, the neighborhood felt different. Birds chirped, the sun rose, lawns glistened with dew, but under the surface, tension ran deep. Gossip traveled faster than the sprinklers could soak the grass. I walked past neighbors' houses, nodding politely, while their eyes flicked toward me, curious, suspicious, or maybe even admiring. Everyone sensed something had changed. I knew the HOA would convene an emergency meeting. They'd sit behind polished tables, trying to regain authority, but the balance had shifted. The pool, once a symbol of control and perfection, had become a testament to disruption. I could imagine the board members' faces, flushed with frustration, as they replayed the incident over and over, trying to pinpoint how it happened, who was responsible, and how to restore their illusion of power. Word reached me through hushed whispers at the mailbox, in passing nods on the street, and even in casual conversations during my morning coffee run. Have you seen the pool? Do you know who did it? It's insane. Each question, each speculation, reinforced the subtle victory. They didn't know it was me, but their anxiety confirmed that my actions had shaken the very foundation of their rigid hierarchy. I watched as contractors continued draining and cleaning, as the HOA frantically catalogued the damage for insurance, and as their perfectly orchestrated control began to unravel. Every muddy swirl in the pool reflected not just soil, but weeks of frustration, lost authority, and unspoken consequences. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and relief. This wasn't chaos for chaos's sake, it was validation. At home, I traced the jagged edges of my broken fence, remembering how helpless I had felt, the anger that burned each time I saw the ruined wood. But now, for the first time, that anger had transformed into something more: clarity, purpose, and a quiet, steady triumph. I realized that I had taken back more than just dignity, I had rewritten the rules of engagement in my little corner of the world. Yet I also knew this wasn't the end. The HOA would investigate, they would question, and some would even suspect neighbors, friends, or random passers-by. The suspense, the waiting, added another layer of tension to the story. Every glance from a neighbor or board member felt loaded, like a subtle acknowledgement that nothing would ever be exactly the same. That night, as I looked out over my backyard and the remains of the fence, I smiled. Justice wasn't loud or obvious, it was deliberate, methodical, and deeply satisfying. Just when I thought the storm had settled, the HOA regrouped. By mid-morning, official letters began appearing in my mailbox. They were polite in tone but heavy with implication, fines, warnings, and veiled threats of legal action. They claimed property damage, trespassing, and implied malicious intent. Their words were precise, calculated to intimidate, but I didn't flinch. I read each letter slowly, savoring the irony. The same organization that had destroyed my fence without consequence now accused me of reckless behavior and intentional sabotage. The audacity was almost comical. They were furious, flustered, and desperate to reclaim control, but their carefully constructed facade had cracks, and I had shattered it with a single night of meticulous planning. The community buzzed with whispers. Some neighbors defended me quietly, recalling years of petty rules and harsh judgments they had endured under the HOA's reign. Others speculated about what had really happened, eyes darting toward my yard, measuring my calm demeanor against the chaos that had invaded the neighborhood. I stayed composed, outwardly calm, yet internally, I felt a surge of validation. Their fear, their confusion, was evidence that I had succeeded. In the background, the cleanup continued. Contractors scrubbed tiles, drained murky water, and hauled away sludge, muttering under their breath about the scale of the mess. The HOA's attempts to reassert control were visible but ineffective. Their voices were loud, but the impact of my action echoed louder. The pristine image they had cultivated for years had been tarnished, irreversibly. As the day wore on, I reflected on the broader lesson. Power without accountability is fragile. Control without respect is temporary. For weeks, I had endured bureaucracy, threats, and humiliation. Now, with their pool in disarray and their authority shaken, I understood the subtle but profound impact of taking a stand. My revenge was measured, deliberate, and symbolic. It was never about destruction for the sake of destruction. Even as the HOA drafted reports, summoned board meetings, and exchanged heated calls, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The mud had done its work. Every frantic expression, every repeated demand for answers, confirmed that I had disrupted their illusion of infallibility. By evening, the neighborhood settled into a tense calm. The pool remained a muddy reminder of their vulnerability, the cleanup only partially masking the chaos they had once dismissed as trivial. And in my backyard, I stood by the remnants of my fence, knowing that the balance had shifted not through violence, but through patience, precision, and undeniable consequence. The story wasn't over, but the HOA had learned the hard truth: respect is earned, and even the most rigid control can crumble when pushed just far enough. The days following the pool incident were surreal. The neighborhood whispered, rumors spread, and the HOA scrambled to regain a sense of control that no longer existed. The muddy chaos had left a mark far deeper than the surface of the water. It had left a psychological scar on those who had once believed their authority was absolute. I watched from my yard, calm, collected, finally free from the anxiety that had weighed on me for weeks. The HOA held multiple meetings, desperately trying to trace the source of the sabotage. They asked questions, checked cameras, and even questioned neighbors. But they had no leads, no evidence, no proof. Every effort to assert dominance was met with dead ends. The irony was intoxicating. They had controlled rules, fines, and schedules with precision, but one calculated act had turned that control upside down. Meanwhile, my fence, though still damaged, felt symbolic of resilience rather than loss. Each jagged plank reminded me that bureaucracy could break things, but it couldn't break spirit. I repaired what I could, leaving some splintered edges as a testament to what had happened, a subtle monument to justice. By the end of the week, the HOA's power appeared diminished. Neighbors walked with a new sense of awareness, some even nodding subtly in acknowledgement when our eyes met. I realized that the impact wasn't just about revenge, it was about setting boundaries, asserting dignity, and reminding everyone, including the HOA, that accountability matters. I reflected on the process. Patience, observation, planning, and precision had turned frustration into a powerful tool. The muddy pool wasn't just retaliation, it was a lesson delivered without confrontation, without escalation, and without violence. It proved that clever, well-timed action can shift the balance of power, even in environments ruled by rigid control. In the weeks that followed, life returned to a new normal. The HOA attempted to repair both the pool and their reputation, but the memory of that muddy nightmare lingered. And in my yard, the fence, patched yet imperfect, stood as a quiet reminder: resilience and clever strategy can overcome even the most controlling opposition. Looking back, I understood something crucial: revenge isn't always about anger. Sometimes, it's about restoring balance, reclaiming dignity, and teaching lessons that words alone cannot deliver. That muddy pool became a symbol of empowerment, a moment when patience, planning, and precision spoke louder than any fine, letter, or board meeting ever could. And as I sipped my morning coffee, glancing at my repaired fence and the now cleaned HOA pool in the distance, I smiled. The battle had ended not with chaos, but with quiet, undeniable justice.